Hello viewers and welcome back to another episode of The Model Guy. In this episode, I'm going to be taking on Hasegawa's 148 KI-84 HAYATE kit, also known by the Allied reporting name the Frank. The KI-84 was a direct response to the newer Allied fighters that the Japanese were encountering in the Pacific, notably the Hellcat and the Mustang. In 1943, the aircraft first flew after Nakajima decided to finally improve on the most glaring shortfalls in Japanese aircraft, notably the lack of armor and the lack of firepower. In the hands of a competent pilot, the Frank was more than a match for any Allied aircraft it encountered. But just like the German 262, it arrived in too few numbers and too late in the war to really make a difference. Compared to Hasegawa's P40 that I've just built, this kit is phenomenal and is at the complete opposite end of the spectrum. I had zero issues with any fit, and just out of the box, the cockpit has an amazing amount of detail. The only thing I did was added some stretch sprue and some seat belts, and this cockpit could have easily competed with TAMIYA's 148 New Tool Zero. There, I said it, and if picking this kit up for $30, I would definitely build this again. The only difficulty I really ran into building this kit initially was trying to find the proper colors for the cockpit. The kit was calling out for a Toki green or Nakajima green, but I ended up finding some more information on jaircraft.com where the author and several sources stated that some of the Franks had a gray interior, which was completely different than other aircraft the Japanese were using at the time. So because it was different and it was interesting, I decided to go with the gray color. One reason that I use acrylic-based VALLEJO paints on top of the lacquer base color paints is that if I make a mistake, I can just come in with a little bit of acrylic thinner and remove the paint without damaging the color underneath and causing myself to have to take a few steps backwards. One quick and dirty thing I like to do to bring out the detail in the cockpit is just do a little bit of dry brushing. That highlights all the little details that otherwise may not be visible. The decal for the instrument panel was kind of meh, so I decided to highlight the dials and everything with some dry brushing first, and then came in and started painting the actual gauges with some white paint. Because the amount of detail Hasegawa has on this panel, it makes it very easy to bring it to another level. Hopefully you caught it earlier in the video when I laid down my base color with Mr. Silver 8, because this is a very durable, hard paint that you can put a lacquer color on top of and not have to use chipping fluid. You can remove it, paint up from the top of it pretty easily, and by using a needle or a toothpick, you can really have some fine scratches that bring the cockpit to life. With the paint dry on the instrument panel, it was time to bring in the glass effect by using a little bit of TAMIYA Gloss Clear. Once the glass on the dials are done on the instrument panel, it's time to make the cockpit look a little grimy. And I'm going to use some oils to do this, but first I'm going to put down a flat coat of clear just to make sure that those oil paints stick. If you use a gloss, they tend to wipe right away and don't stay in place. Semi-gloss, not too bad, but for a cockpit, I'll use flat because it really gets the paints to stick in the corners and it makes it a little bit easier to work with. If you've built an armor vehicle before or you've watched the videos, you'll recognize this instantly as basically the oil dot filter technique. And all this is going to do is change the tones of the colors underneath. Instead of using some colors based on gray, I'm actually using some dirtier colors like browns and beiges just to make it look like the cockpit's dirty and grimy. The nice thing about ABTEILUNG oil paints is that just by adding a little bit more thinner, you can create washes and filters with them instead of spending money on custom built ones, which are essentially the same thing. And now with the cockpit completed, it's time to assemble it and say goodbye to most of that detail, which is never fun, but at least I know it's there. As I stated earlier as well, this kit goes together with almost no fuss. There's a little bit of filler I'll need on the bottom and the top, but other than that, there's no putty needed. For me personally, I like to wait until I have primer on the plastic before I start to do any body work, because I find that perfect plastic putty, which I very rarely use, and also TAMIYA basic putty doesn't like to stick to plastic all that well, and with a primer coat, it stays better and doesn't just roll off as you're trying to sand it. With the tolerances on this kit being so tight, I was hoping to get away with a little bit of sanding without having to do body work, but the first coat of primer would show otherwise. You may have noticed in the background that fancy P51 cutting mat I'm using, and that's been supplied by Tankcraft. They supply mats in 2 different sizes, and they make your bench look so much more professional. There's lots of detail in them. They have Shermans, Tigers, Panthers, all different subjects you can check out, and they're very resistant to cutting and very durable. The one thing they say on their site is to try to keep lacquer paints away from them, and personally I'd be nervous about painting over them anyways, as I wouldn't want to damage them. So once again, Brad, thank you for sending those, and if you're interested in them, check out Tancraft and they can hook you up. Getting back to the build, before primer or any painting, I want to make sure that the surface is clean, and to do that I'm spraying it down, pretty much hosing it down with isopropyl alcohol, and that's going to remove any oils from my fingers or dust or anything on the surface and make sure that it's nice and clean for the primer to bite into. By thinning down the Mr. Surfacer primer and adding it in thinner coats and building it up, it gives me a much smoother surface to work with, and there's less sanding and prep work involved compared to if you hose it on. Then you'd have to do a little more sanding to have that nice, smooth finish. Primer coat showed some imperfections in the leading edge of the wing and the spine, but that was easily cleaned up with some putty before moving on to riveting. If this is something you're interested in doing yourself, I have a tutorial video on my channel which goes into a lot more depth than I will here, but it's pretty straightforward. You're just putting tiny, tiny holes in the surface of the aircraft. Now, I know a rivet in real life is not a dimple or a hole. It's something solid that's there. But by putting that little tiny hole there in the surface of the model, it's going to catch any washes or oils. That'll make it look like that there is a rivet there catching dirt. I know it's not 100% accurate, but it does give you a lot more detail than you would have with just a 2D rivet there. And then once the riveting is complete, I clean out all those little tiny dimples with some 100% distilled water and get the aircraft ready for paint. Once the windscreen is glued on the model, it's time to paint the rear area that's under the rear section of the canopy. I won't lie to you, I had the rear section of the canopy in my hand ready to glue on before I realized that I hadn't painted that part of the aircraft yet before gluing it on. So luckily I caught that without having to cut it off after it was on. Once again, the instructions were calling for a taupe green, but research was showing that this should be the same color as the interior of the aircraft. So there's that gray again. Another thing that's hard to replicate on a model for Japanese aircraft is the proper aluminum color. It's not like a P-51 or a natural metal Thunderbolt where it's very shiny and lots of different variation in the tone. The Japanese stuff has its own weird color where it's a little bit brighter with less luster, where it almost looks white in some pictures. So what I've done is, instead of putting a black glossy base coat down, I'm just firing the silver on top of the gray to try to suck some of the luster out of it. And to keep things even more simple, I'm using Mr. Metal Color Aluminum because it's a lacquer, and having used it on a test aircraft, it stands up to handling very well. AK Extreme Metal, for some reason, even after a week of drying, still likes to wipe off in some areas, so I chose to stay with the lacquer on this just because it was going to get handled quite a bit with the type of painting I was doing. One thing that I'm definitely going to do different next time when I'm doing an aluminum aircraft is painting the markings on first. This is the second time I've done a metal aircraft and painted the markings on afterwards, and because that paint is so glossy, my theory is that the lacquer paints aren't biting into it so well. So I think next time I'm going to have to flip the order. I know Duke does that on his channel, and that may be something I need to copy. Just like on my Zero build, when I was doing the Hinomaru markings on this aircraft, I kept them in generally good condition because Japanese ground crews often touch them up as a sign of respect to the emperor. So I didn't want to beat those up, just a little bit of weathering just to add some flavor, but nothing too crazy, especially chipping. If you're interested in painting on markings instead of using decals, these are probably the easiest ones to start with. All you need is a compass cutter, and OLFA makes a pretty good one. I made my masks using the Silhouette machine. Now, the biggest challenge for this kit was getting the camouflage right. Because it's soft-edged, I can't use a mask to do it. And it doesn't overlay the same way as the Zeros did. So to do this, I had to experiment on a paint mule for a few nights by trying different thinner ratios, different pressures, different distances, and stuff like that. And in the end, doing it by hand was going to be easier than trying to do soft masking because of the way the camouflage flows and dances around on the aircraft. So what I've done, I've pulled the cap off the needle of the airbrush that protects the needle, and I'm almost touching it to get a nice hard edge. And instead of trying to draw the camouflage in one pass, what I'm doing is kind of making little puffs on the fuselage where the camouflage should go, and then following it around, tracing outlines. And considering that these were painted on in the field, I also didn't want them to be perfect. So there's a lot of transparency, there's a lot of weird changes, and trying to get that in scale was a bigger challenge than trying to find the right ratio for thinning. When I was doing it by hand, I had the instructions blown up to a 1:1 scale to follow, but I also had to consider that someone's arms in 1/48 scale and how far they'd be able to reach while sitting on the aircraft. So this was a lot harder than just putting on some squiggly lines. So while you're sitting here watching this, why don't you take a moment to write in the comment section below, what is the hardest camouflage or livery you've ever had to paint on a model? There's always some good discussion from those questions, so I hope you take part in it and enjoy it. For me personally, this was definitely the hardest camouflage I've done to date because it's completely freehand, and that's something I'm still trying to get a handle on with airbrushing. But it's like learning any new skill. You have to keep trying it over and over again before you can really start to master it. And I don't want to use the word master because I'm far away from doing that with model building. But there's one comment I always see on different videos and on my channel here is when people say something like, I wish I could build as good as you or as good as this person. And one thing, it's always cool to hear that because you know someone's looking at your videos for learning that. But at the same time, I didn't just pick this stuff up overnight. This is the accumulation of a lot of failing and a lot of trial and error. And for me personally, I know I learn a lot better if I fail at something. I repainted the Tojo twice while I was practicing this leading up to the painting and the camouflage before I was confident to put it on the actual model. So when you see videos like this, I know when I'm watching Plasmo and Night Shift and guys like that, I also have the mindset that these guys have been doing it for a long time, and it's something that they're always improving on, and they didn't start at the bench right away blowing minds. So if you're that person watching right now and you're thinking, holy crap, this is amazing, I'm never gonna be able to do that. Yeah, you can. Just practice it. Practice, practice, practice. Fail, fail, fail. Suck and suck and suck. And then there gets to be a point where you actually start to get better at it. So don't be afraid to try new stuff. Now that all the painting with the lacquer paints is complete, it's now time to create a barrier coat to protect it by putting down a semi-gloss clear coat. And what this is going to do, it's going to give the oil paint something to stick to a little bit, but still give you the ability to wipe it off if it's in areas you don't like. While doing my research for the Frank, it turned out that there's 3 possible colors that I could be using for the propeller. The first one being the typical propeller brown, the second one being aluminum, and the third being this dark green color that seemed to be a little bit brighter than the camouflage on the aircraft. With so much silver and aluminum already on the aircraft, I felt that an aluminum prop wouldn't really stand out at all, so I decided to go with the green just because it popped a little bit because it was so different. One of the nice things about this Hasegawa kit is that there's so much detail in that radial engine, you have a great base to do any scratch building you want to. In this case, I chose not to do scratch building because it was part of a group build, so there's a little more of a time constraint than usual. Plus, with the big spinner and the engine seated back a little bit further, I decided that they weren't going to be visible enough to really put the effort into it. However, if I was to build this kit again, which I probably will at some point, I would definitely do the ignition leads. But in this point, with the time constraint, it wasn't worth doing it. Because the white aluminum on the crankcase didn't differ a whole lot from the aluminum of the cylinders, I decided to be a little bit heavier on the wash on the cylinder banks just to break up that monotony a little bit of the silver. The nice thing about oil paints is they're very versatile, so you can get all kinds of different effects just using the same color. Where I used the Starship Filth as a type of wash on the cylinders, I actually used it in a stippling motion on the crankcase cover just to make it look like a little bit of oil had been leaking past the seals. The only real negative thing I have to say about this Hasegawa kit is the decals were old in it and they started to fall apart when I was trying to use them, so it actually was easier to paint the warning stripes on the propeller. Because that Mr. Metal Color lacquer aluminum was so durable, all I had to do any chipping on the paint above it was just spray on a lacquer acrylic. So this is a mix, the same color red as the roundels, but I put it on top with no chipping fluid and just came in with a needle just to make some tiny microchips. For oils on this aircraft, because it's silver and green, I didn't want to use black because that would have been too stark in contrast, so I ended up doing a shadow brown pin wash just to bring out those panel lines a bit. And lastly with the build, I drilled out the gun barrels just to make them look a little bit better than solid pipes. And that's going to pretty much bring this build to a close. I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you have, click the like button, click subscribe if you haven't already, and leave a comment in the comment section below. If you didn't like it, please let me know why, and I'll try to see what I can do to make things a little bit better for the next one. If you'd like to, I'm also on Patreon. You can join these fine people, along with former President George Bush, in supporting the page financially. Even the low price of $1 a month gets you in the door to check out what's going on. I am the Model Guy. I hope you've enjoyed the video, and I'll see you next time.